David Rodriguez adjusted his navy blue Doorman uniform one last time before the evening rush began. The brass buttons gleamed under the bright lights of the Grandview Country Club's entrance, each one polished to perfection. At 28 years old, he had mastered the art of becoming invisible to the wealthy guests who walked past him every day. The Grandview wasn't just any country club. It was the kind of place where membership cost more than most people's annual salary, where parking spaces were filled with cars that cost six figures, and where casual conversations involved millions of dollars. David had been working here for 3 years now, watching the same faces come and go, learning their habits, their preferences, and their complete indifference to his existence. What these wealthy members didn't know was that David had once walked among their kind, at least academically. Hidden in his small apartment was a framed diploma from Wharton Business School, where he had graduated with highest honors and an MBA in finance. His professors had called him brilliant. His classmates had predicted he would run his own company by 30. Investment firms had courted him with promising offers, but life had other plans. His father's cancer diagnosis had come just 2 weeks before David's graduation. The medical bills started small, then grew like a monster that couldn't be fed enough. Insurance covered some costs, but the experimental treatments, the specialists, the round-the-clock care his father needed, none of that came cheap. David's mother worked double shifts at the hospital as a nurse, but it wasn't enough. His younger sister was still in college, and David couldn't bear to ask her to drop out, so he took the first job he could find that paid decent money and had flexible hours. The doorman position at Grandview paid surprisingly well, thanks to the generous tips from guilt-ridden millionaires who occasionally remembered to acknowledge his presence. It was meant to be temporary, just until his father recovered and the debts were manageable. That was 3 years ago. His father had beaten cancer, but the financial damage was done. David was still paying off medical bills that seemed to multiply like rabbits. Every month, he calculated and recalculated his budget, applying the same financial skills that had made him a star student to the humble task of making ends meet. Tonight was different, though. Tonight was the annual charity gala, the biggest event of the year at Grandview. The club had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, with crystal chandeliers casting rainbows on the marble floors and flower arrangements that probably cost more than David's monthly rent. The who's who of the business world would be walking through his doors tonight. The first guests began arriving at 6 o'clock sharp. David opened car doors, helped elderly members up the steps, and directed traffic with the efficiency of an air traffic controller. A pharmaceutical CEO tipped him $20 and didn't make eye contact. A real estate mogul's wife complained that her driver was 2 minutes late and acted as if it were David's fault. A tech entrepreneur bragged loudly on his phone about his latest acquisition, while David held the door open, waiting patiently for him to finish his call and enter. David watched it all with the trained eye of someone who had studied these people's businesses in school. He knew their company's stock prices, their recent mergers, their quarterly reports. It was a habit he couldn't break, this constant analysis of the business world he had once hoped to join. Sometimes he wanted to speak up, to share an insight or ask a thoughtful question about their strategies. But his uniform was like an invisibility cloak that made such interactions impossible. The irony wasn't lost on him. He spent his days opening doors for people who made financial decisions he could probably improve, who ran companies he understood better than they realized. But in their eyes, he was just part of the furniture, as essential and unnoticed as the marble columns that held up the building. As the evening progressed, David noticed the excitement building inside the club. Tonight's gala had a special purpose beyond the usual charity fundraising. Victoria Sterling, the tech industry's golden child, was going to announce her engagement to investment banker Richard Blackwood. The news had been rumored for weeks, and tonight would make it official. David knew Victoria's story well. She had built her software empire from nothing, starting in her college dorm room and growing it into a company worth billions. Her apps and platforms were used by millions of people worldwide. At 32, she was one of the youngest billionaires in the world, gracing magazine covers and speaking at conferences about innovation and leadership. She was exactly the kind of success story David had once imagined for himself. Through the tall windows, David could see the party in full swing inside. Women in designer gowns that cost more than luxury cars mingled with men in custom suits discussing deals that would make headlines tomorrow. Waiters carried champagne that probably cost hundreds of dollars per bottle. The charity auction items included vacations to private islands and artwork by famous painters. David's phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Dad's feeling good today. Says to tell you he's proud of you." David smiled, the first genuine smile of his shift. His father's recovery had been worth every sacrifice, every humble moment, every dream deferred. Some things were more important than career ambitions. A commotion inside caught his attention. Through the windows, he could see Victoria Sterling making her entrance to the main ballroom. She moved like royalty, commanding attention without trying. Her presence seemed to shift the entire energy of the room. Conversations paused, heads turned, and phones appeared to capture the moment. David had to admit she was impressive. Not just beautiful in the way that money and stylists could create, but genuinely magnetic. There was an intelligence in her eyes and a confidence in her posture that spoke of someone who had earned her success through more than luck or connections. She was the kind of person David had once hoped to become, brilliant, successful, and powerful enough to change the world. The evening continued with its predictable rhythm. More cars arrived, more doors were opened, more wealthy guests swept past David without acknowledgement. He helped an elderly oil executive who thanked him kindly and reminded David that good people existed at every level of society. He directed a lost socialite to the ladies' room and received a dismissive wave in return. He watched a young heir stumble slightly from too much champagne and steadied him with a gentle hand, earning a confused look as if the young man couldn't understand why the help was touching him. By 9 o'clock, most of the guests had arrived, and David's evening was settling into the quieter routine of managing late arrivals and early departures. The sounds of laughter and music drifted from inside, mixing with the classical quartet that played in the main ballroom. Occasionally, David caught glimpses of the party through the windows. A whirl of expensive fabric, gleaming jewelry, and animated conversations about things that would never touch his world. As he stood at his post, David sometimes wondered what would have happened if his life had gone differently. If his father hadn't gotten sick, if the medical bills hadn't destroyed their savings, if he had been able to take one of those promising job offers after graduation. Would he be inside right now, wearing a custom tuxedo instead of a doorman's uniform? Would he be the one making deals and shaping industries? But those thoughts never lasted long. David had learned to find peace in his current life, even if it wasn't the one he had planned. He was helping his family, he was honest work, and he was learning patience and humility in ways his business school classmates probably never would. There was dignity in any honest job, his father always told him, and David had come to believe that was true. The night was about to take a turn that would change everything, though David didn't know it yet. Sometimes, the most important moments in our lives arrive without warning, disguised as ordinary interactions that seem insignificant at the time. Sometimes the very people who dismiss us hold the keys to our future, and sometimes proving our worth requires us to risk everything we've carefully built. David straightened his shoulders and checked his watch. The evening was far from over, and his real test was still to come. David's heart pounded as he answered the phone. On the other end was a crisp, professional voice that he recognized as Victoria's assistant. "Mr. Rodriguez, this is Jennifer from Miss Sterling's office. She received your email about a restructuring proposal. I have to say she's intrigued but also skeptical. She's agreed to give you exactly 5 minutes of her time this morning at 10 o'clock. Can you be here?" David glanced at his watch. It was 8:30. Sterling Enterprises headquarters was downtown, about a 40-minute drive in morning traffic. "I'll be there," he said, trying to keep the excitement out of his voice. "Good. Security will have your name." "Don't be late. Miss Sterling's schedule is packed today with emergency meetings." The line went dead. David stared at his phone for a moment, hardly believing what had just happened. Less than 12 hours after being humiliated at the country club, he was about to walk into Victoria Sterling's office with a plan to save her company. David grabbed his laptop bag, the presentation he had printed at a 24-hour copy shop, and his business school diploma. The diploma had been sitting in a frame on his bookshelf for 3 years, gathering dust. Today, it might finally serve its purpose. The drive downtown gave David time to think and prepare. He reviewed his talking points, practiced his opening lines, and tried to calm his nerves. This wasn't just about proving Victoria wrong anymore. This was about potentially saving thousands of jobs and rescuing a company that could continue to innovate and grow if properly managed. Sterling Enterprises occupied the top, 15 floors of a gleaming downtown skyscraper. David had driven past it countless times during his years as a doorman, never imagining he would one day walk through its doors as anything other than a visitor. The lobby was all marble and glass, with abstract art that probably cost more than most people's houses. Security was expecting him, but the guards still looked puzzled as they handed him a visitor's badge. David could see them wondering what someone like him was doing here for a meeting with the CEO. Their confusion would be nothing compared to Victoria's reaction when she realized who her mysterious financial analyst really was. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like it lasted forever. David used the time to center himself, remembering lessons from his business school presentation classes. Confidence was key. Knowledge was power, and he had both, even if Victoria didn't know it yet. Victoria's office suite was bigger than David's entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, and the furniture looked like it belonged in a museum. Victoria herself sat behind a desk that was probably worth more than David's annual salary, wearing a perfectly tailored business suit and an expression of barely controlled frustration. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, without looking up from the papers scattered across her desk. "I hope you're not wasting my time. I have 3 emergency board meetings today and a conference call with our attorneys in 20 minutes. David walked into the office, and Victoria finally looked up. The recognition hit her like a physical blow. Her perfectly composed expression cracked, and for a moment she looked completely stunned. "You," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're the doorman from last night?" "Yes, ma'am," David replied calmly, setting his briefcase down and taking the seat across from her desk without being invited. "I'm also David Rodriguez, MBA in Finance from Wharton Business School, and I'm here to save your company." Victoria stared at him for a long moment, clearly trying to process this unexpected turn of events. Then she started to laugh, not the cruel laughter from the night before, but the kind of desperate laughter that comes when someone's world has been turned completely upside down. "This is ridiculous," she said, shaking her head. "You're a doorman. You open car doors and carry luggage. What could you possibly know about running a billion-dollar corporation?" David reached into his briefcase and pulled out his diploma, placing it on her desk where she could see it clearly. Victoria's laughter stopped abruptly as she read the formal script and official seals. "Wharton Business School," David said quietly. "Graduated summa cum laude 3 years ago. I turned down offers from Goldman Sachs and McKinsey to take care of my family when my father was diagnosed with cancer. Sometimes life doesn't go according to plan. Ms. Sterling, sometimes the most qualified person in the room is wearing a uniform instead of a designer suit." Victoria picked up the diploma, examining it closely as if looking for signs that it was fake. David could see the wheels turning in her mind, trying to reconcile the man she had dismissed so casually with the credentials in front of her. "Even if this is real," she said finally, "what makes you think you can solve problems that the best investment firms in the country have walked away from?" David opened his laptop and turned it toward her, displaying the first slide of his presentation. "Because I've spent the last 6 hours analyzing your company's financial situation, and I've found something that everyone else missed." For the next 20 minutes, David walked Victoria through his analysis. He showed her exactly where the TechFlow integration had gone wrong, why the company was bleeding money, and most importantly, how it could all be fixed. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had mastered these concepts years ago and the passion of someone who genuinely believed in his solution. Victoria's skepticism gradually gave way to surprise, then to genuine interest. She asked sharp questions that David answered without hesitation. She challenged his assumptions, and he backed up every point with data and projections. By the time he reached his final recommendations, Victoria was leaning forward in her chair, completely engaged. "Your analysis of the AI platform integration is brilliant," she admitted grudgingly. "I hadn't considered spinning it off as a separate revenue stream. And this debt restructuring plan, it's actually feasible." "It's more than feasible," David said. "It's your only real option. Your company has maybe 48 hours before the bankruptcy filing deadline. Every other solution I've seen focuses on cutting costs and selling assets. This plan focuses on maximizing the value of what you already have." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, studying the financial projections on David's laptop screen. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, softer, more thoughtful. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "After what happened last night, you could have just walked away. You could have let my company fail and felt justified about it." David considered the question carefully. "Because thousands of people work for Sterling Enterprises. They have families, mortgages, kids in college. Your company failing doesn't just hurt you, it hurts all of them. And because," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "because I believe everyone deserves a chance to prove what they're capable of, regardless of what they're wearing or where they're standing." The implied criticism wasn't lost on Victoria. She had the grace to look embarrassed as she remembered her behavior from the night before. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "What I said last night was inexcusable. I judged you based on your job instead of your character, and I was completely wrong." "Apology accepted," David said. "But right now, we have bigger problems to solve. This plan will work, but it needs to be implemented immediately. Every day we wait, your company loses more value and credibility." Victoria nodded, her business instincts taking over. "What do you need from me?" "A board meeting. Today. I need to present this plan to your directors and get their approval for the restructuring. And I need you to vouch for my credentials and my analysis." "Done," Victoria said without hesitation. "Jennifer," she called to her assistant, "cancel my afternoon meetings and set up an emergency board session for 2 o'clock. Full attendance required." As her assistant hurried to make the arrangements, Victoria turned back to David. "I have one more question. Last night I said I'd marry you if you could perform at my level. Were you serious about holding me to that?" David smiled for the first time since entering her office. "Ms. Sterling, I didn't come here to collect on a bet made in anger. I came here to prove a point about dignity and respect. But if you're asking whether I'd be interested in getting to know the real Victoria Sterling, the brilliant businesswoman who built this company from nothing, not the person who judges others by their uniforms, well, that's a conversation for after we save your company." Victoria smiled back. And for the first time, David saw something genuine in her expression. Something that suggested there was more to her than the arrogant socialite from the country club. "Let's save my company first," she said. "Then we'll see what else might be possible." The sleek black Bentley rolled up to the entrance like a panther stalking its prey. David had seen expensive cars all evening, but this one was different. Custom paint, hand-stitched interior visible through the tinted windows, and a license plate that simply read Sterling 1. He didn't need to guess who was inside. Victoria Sterling stepped out of the car with the grace of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. Her emerald green gown flowed like liquid silk, catching the light from the club's entrance in a way that made her seem to glow. Diamond earrings caught the light as she moved, and her hair was styled in an elegant updo that probably took hours to perfect. Everything about her screamed success, power, and money. David moved forward to close the car door behind her, a routine he had performed hundreds of times. But as Victoria turned to walk toward the entrance, her diamond bracelet caught on her purse strap. The delicate clasp snapped, and the bracelet tumbled toward the ground in what felt like slow motion. Without thinking, David stepped forward and caught the bracelet before it could hit the concrete. The diamonds were real, he could tell immediately. This wasn't costume jewelry or even expensive fashion accessories. This was the kind of bracelet that cost more than most people's cars. He had studied enough about luxury markets to recognize genuine craftsmanship when he saw it. "Ma'am, your bracelet," David said politely, holding it out to her with both hands. The way he had been trained to handle valuable items. Victoria's reaction was instant and harsh. She snatched the bracelet from his hands as if he had stolen it rather than saved it. Her perfectly manicured fingers clutched the jewelry protectively against her chest, and her eyes flashed with an anger that seemed completely out of proportion to what had just happened. "Don't touch that with your filthy hands," she snapped, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet evening air. "Do you have any idea what this costs? It's probably worth more than you make in 5 years." The words hit David like a physical blow. He had been helping her, trying to prevent her expensive jewelry from being damaged or lost. Instead of gratitude, he was getting insults and assumptions about his worth as a human being. He kept his expression neutral, years of customer service training kicking in automatically. Richard Blackwood climbed out of the car behind Victoria, adjusting his designer tuxedo with the casual arrogance of someone who had never worked a day for anything in his life. He was handsome in the way that expensive grooming and personal trainers could create, but there was something cold in his eyes as he looked at David, something that suggested he enjoyed watching other people get put in their place. "Darling, you're being too generous," Richard said with a laugh that had no warmth in it. "Try 10 years, maybe 15 if he's lucky." A small crowd of wealthy guests had started to gather near the entrance, drawn by the commotion like sharks sensing blood in the water. David recognized some of them from his 3 years at the club. There was Mrs. Patterson, the pharmaceutical heiress who never tipped, Mr. Chen, the real estate mogul who always parked his car crooked and made David fix it, Dr. Williams, the plastic surgeon who treated the staff like they were invisible. They were all watching now, their expressions ranging from mild amusement to eager anticipation. This was entertainment for them, a brief diversion from their evening of champagne and charity auctions. David realized he had become the evening's unexpected floor show. "My deepest apologies, Mrs. Sterling," David said carefully, maintaining his professional tone despite the heat he felt rising in his cheeks. "I was only trying to help prevent your bracelet from being damaged." Victoria's eyes narrowed as she studied him, and David could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was enjoying this, he realized. The attention, the power, the ability to humiliate someone in front of an audience. This wasn't just about the bracelet anymore. This was about putting someone she saw as beneath her in his proper place. "Help?" Victoria repeated the word like it tasted bad in her mouth. "The only way someone like you could help someone like me is if you could perform miracles. But we both know that's completely impossible, don't we?" The crowd was growing larger now, and David could hear whispered comments and quiet laughter. Someone was probably recording this on their phone, he thought. By tomorrow, this could be all over social media, the arrogant billionaire putting the help in his place. But he was the help in this scenario, not the sympathetic figure. Victoria was clearly warming to her theme now, feeding off the energy of her audience. She took a step closer to David, her voice dropping to a tone that was somehow more insulting than if she had shouted. "You know what?" she said, a cruel smile playing at the corners of her perfectly painted lips. "I'm feeling generous tonight. It is a charity gala after all." Richard chuckled beside her, clearly knowing where this was going. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that something memorable was about to happen. David felt trapped, surrounded by people who saw him as entertainment rather than a human being. "I'll make you a deal," Victoria continued, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear clearly. "If you can somehow prove that you're capable of performing at my level, actually achieving something impressive, something that matters in the real world, then I'll marry you instead of Richard here." The crowd erupted in laughter at this suggestion. The idea was so ridiculous, so impossible, that it struck them as the height of comedy. A doorman marrying a billionaire tech mogul? A man in a uniform competing with someone who owned companies and appeared on magazine covers? It was the kind of joke that would be repeated at dinner parties for months to come. "But since that's absolutely impossible," Victoria continued, raising her voice over the laughter, "I suppose Richard and I are perfectly safe. Aren't we, darling?" Richard nodded, his arm sliding possessively around Victoria's waist. "Completely safe, sweetheart. I don't think we have anything to worry about from the help." David felt every eye in the crowd focused on him, waiting for his reaction. He could walk away, he supposed. He could simply return to his post and let this moment pass into memory. That would be the safe choice, the smart choice. These people would forget about him in 5 minutes and move on to their champagne and their charity auction. But something inside David had snapped. Not broken exactly, but shifted into a different position. For 3 years, he had swallowed his pride, accepted the casual dismissals and thoughtless cruelty of people who had been born into advantages they had never earned. He had told himself it was temporary, that he was just paying his dues until he could return to the career he had trained for. But this felt different. This wasn't just casual indifference or unconscious snobbery. This was deliberate humiliation, performed for an audience's entertainment. Victoria Sterling had turned him into a joke, a prop in her display of superiority. She had made assumptions about his worth based on nothing more than his uniform and his willingness to be helpful. "I understand completely, Miss Sterling," David said quietly, his voice steady despite the fury building inside him. "Enjoy your evening." He turned and walked back to his position by the door, leaving Victoria and her audience to their laughter. But as he walked, David's mind was already working, calculating possibilities and analyzing opportunities the way he had been trained to do in business school. Victoria Sterling thought she knew everything about him based on his appearance and his job. She thought she was safe from any challenge he might present. She was about to learn how wrong she could be. The crowd gradually dispersed, moving into the club to continue their evening of excess and entertainment. Victoria and Richard swept through the entrance like conquering royalty, accepting congratulations on their engagement and basking in the attention of their wealthy peers. David remained at his post, opening doors and managing traffic as if nothing had happened, but everything had changed. For 3 years, he had been content to remain invisible, to let these people assume whatever they wanted about him. Tonight, that invisibility had become a weapon. Victoria Sterling had just made the biggest mistake of her career, though she didn't know it yet. She had challenged someone who was far more capable than she realized, and she had done it in front of witnesses who would remember every word. The game had begun, and David was already planning his first move. The rest of David's shift passed in a blur of forced smiles and automatic responses. He opened doors, directed guests, and managed the steady flow of expensive cars as if nothing had happened. But inside, his mind was racing like a computer processing complex calculations. Every business conversation he overheard, every snippet of corporate gossip, every casual mention of stock prices and market trends, everything was being filed away and analyzed. Around 11 o'clock, as the evening began to wind down, David overheard something that made his blood freeze. 2 investment bankers were standing near the entrance, smoking expensive cigars and talking in the careless way that wealthy men do when they think no one important is listening. "Sterling's in deeper trouble than anyone knows," the first banker said, shaking his head. "The TechFlow acquisition was a disaster. They paid $3 billion for a company that's worth maybe $500 million on a good day." "I heard it's worse than that," the second banker replied, lowering his voice slightly. "Word is she needs a $500 million bailout, and she needs it in the next 72 hours. If she can't secure emergency funding by Thursday, Sterling Enterprises files for bankruptcy protection." David felt his heart skip a beat. Victoria Sterling, the woman who had just humiliated him in front of a crowd, was facing the collapse of her entire empire. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Here was someone who had judged his worth by his uniform and his paycheck, and she was about to lose everything that made her feel superior. "Who's she talking to for the bailout?" the first banker asked. "Everyone and no one." Goldman passed. "Morgan Stanley won't return her calls. Word on the street is that nobody wants to touch this mess. The TechFlow acquisition poisoned the whole company. Bad leadership, worse execution, and now the bills are coming due." David listened with growing amazement. This wasn't just corporate gossip. This was inside information about one of the biggest potential business failures of the decade. And he was hearing it because rich people talked freely in front of service workers, treating them like furniture that couldn't understand complex financial discussions. The bankers finished their cigars and went back inside, leaving David alone with information that could change everything. He pulled out his phone and quickly searched for recent news about Sterling Enterprises. The official reports were carefully worded, but between the lines he could see the truth. The company was in serious trouble, and Victoria's public confidence was nothing more than an expensive mask hiding desperation. David's shift ended at midnight, but he barely noticed the time passing. As soon as he was relieved by the night security guard, he hurried to his small apartment across town. The one-bedroom place was nothing like the luxury he had briefly experienced during his business school days. But it was clean and quiet, and most importantly, it had high-speed internet and a reliable laptop. He made a pot of strong coffee and settled down at his small kitchen table, opening his laptop and diving into research mode. This felt familiar in a way that nothing had for 3 years. This was what he had been trained for, what he was good at, what made his mind come alive with possibilities and connections. David started by pulling up Sterling Enterprises' financial reports from the past 2 years. The numbers told a story that the glossy press releases tried to hide. The TechFlow acquisition had been a massive gamble that hadn't paid off. Victoria had bet big on artificial intelligence and virtual reality markets that hadn't developed as quickly as predicted. The technologies were promising, but the execution had been flawed from the beginning. As he dug deeper, David began to see patterns that others had missed. The problem wasn't just the acquisition itself. It was how the two companies had been integrated. Sterling had tried to force TechFlow's innovative but chaotic startup culture into her own company's rigid corporate structure. The result was like trying to mix oil and water. Key employees had quit, projects had stalled, and customers had fled to competitors. But David could see something else, something that the investment bankers and financial analysts had overlooked. The core technology that TechFlow had developed was actually revolutionary. The artificial intelligence platform they had created was years ahead of anything else on the market. The problem wasn't the technology, it was how it was being used. David's fingers flew across the keyboard as he began sketching out a rescue plan. He drew on everything he had learned in business school, every case study he had analyzed, every financial model he had mastered. The solution was complex but achievable. It would require breaking up the merged companies, selling off the underperforming divisions, and restructuring the debt in a way that gave the core technology room to breathe and grow. By 3 in the morning, David had a rough outline. By 6, he had a detailed presentation with financial projections, market analysis, and a step-by-step implementation timeline. The plan was good. Better than good, it was brilliant. He had identified not just how to save Sterling Enterprises, but how to make it stronger than it had ever been. The key insight was that Victoria had been thinking too small. TechFlow's AI platform wasn't just useful for the applications they had been developing. It could be licensed to dozens of other companies, creating multiple revenue streams. It could be spun off as a separate division, attracting venture capital investment. It could even be taken public as an independent company, potentially worth more than the original TechFlow acquisition price. David leaned back in his chair, exhausted but exhilarated. He had done it. He had found a way to save Victoria Sterling's company using nothing but his brain, his education, and his willingness to work through the night. The woman who had mocked his ability to perform was about to discover just how capable he really was. But having a solution and getting Victoria to listen were two completely different challenges. David knew that if he simply called Sterling Enterprises and asked for a meeting, he would be laughed off the phone. Who would take a doorman seriously when billion-dollar investment firms were walking away from this problem? He needed a strategy, a way to get Victoria's attention that she couldn't ignore. As the morning sun began to filter through his apartment windows, David remembered something from his business school days. One of his professors had always said that in desperate situations, people pay attention to information they would normally dismiss. Victoria Sterling was desperate, even if she was hiding it well. David crafted a carefully worded email and sent it to Victoria's assistant, with copies to the company's board of directors and chief financial officer. The subject line read, "Comprehensive restructuring proposal, time-sensitive." The message was brief but intriguing. "I have a detailed solution for Sterling Enterprises' current financial situation. This proposal addresses the TechFlow integration issues and provides a clear path to profitability. Available for immediate consultation." He signed it simply as David Rodriguez, financial analyst, and included his phone number. Technically, he wasn't lying. He was a financial analyst, even if his current job was opening doors. The email didn't mention his role at the country club. Let them assume he was a consultant or investment professional. Then David did something that surprised even himself. He called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. He told his supervisor at the country club that he had a family emergency and needed the day off. It wasn't entirely untrue. His family's financial future depended on what happened in the next few hours. David showered, shaved, and put on his only good suit, the charcoal gray one he had bought for job interviews after business school. It still fit perfectly, and wearing it made him feel like his old self again. He was no longer David the doorman, invisible and dismissed. He was David Rodriguez, MBA, financial analyst, problem solver. As he adjusted his tie in the mirror, David thought about Victoria Sterling's words from the night before. She had challenged him to prove he could perform at her level, to achieve something impressive in the real world. She had meant it as a joke, an impossible task designed to highlight the gap between them. She was about to learn that the gap wasn't as wide as she thought. In fact, in the next few hours, David was going to prove that he could do something Victoria Sterling couldn't do: save her own company. His phone rang. The caller ID showed Sterling Enterprises. David smiled and answered the call. The boardroom at Sterling Enterprises was intimidating by design. A massive mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by leather chairs that had probably cost more than most people's cars. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city skyline, and oil paintings of former company leaders stared down from the walls like disapproving ancestors. David walked into the room carrying his laptop and a stack of printed presentations, trying not to show how nervous he felt. Around the table sat 12 of the most powerful business leaders in the city, people who controlled billions of dollars and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. They were all looking at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely disguised skepticism. Victoria stood at the head of the table, her usual confidence slightly shaken by the morning's events. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for gathering on such short notice. As you know, we're facing a critical situation with our financial restructuring. Today, I'd like you to hear from David Rodriguez, who has developed what I believe is a viable solution to our current challenges." An elderly man with silver hair and sharp eyes leaned forward in his chair. This was Robert Chen, the board chairman and one of the city's most respected business leaders. "Ms. Sterling, with all due respect, we've already heard proposals from Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and 3 of the top consulting firms in the country. What makes you think this gentleman can offer something they couldn't?" David stepped forward before Victoria could answer. "Because sometimes the best solutions come from people who see problems differently. Mr. Chen, sometimes being outside the traditional financial world gives you a perspective that industry insiders miss." "And what exactly is your background, Mr. Rodriguez?" asked Catherine Williams, the board's finance committee chair. Her tone suggested she had already made up her mind about him. David placed his diploma on the table where everyone could see it. Wharton MBA, specialized in corporate restructuring and financial analysis. "For the past 3 years, I've been working in a different capacity while helping my family through a medical crisis. But education and experience don't disappear just because circumstances change." He opened his laptop and connected it to the room's presentation screen. The first slide appeared, showing a clear, simple outline of Sterling Enterprises' current situation. No fancy graphics or corporate jargon, just honest numbers and straightforward analysis. "Your company is facing bankruptcy not because the core business is flawed, but because of how the TechFlow acquisition was integrated," David began. "Every solution you've been presented with treats this as a financial problem. It's not. It's a strategic problem with a strategic solution." For the next 30 minutes, David walked the board through his analysis. He showed them exactly where the integration had gone wrong, using real examples and specific data points. He explained how TechFlow's innovative culture had been stifled by Sterling's corporate structure, leading to the departure of key personnel and the failure of important projects. The artificial intelligence platform that TechFlow developed is revolutionary, David continued, clicking to a slide showing market projections. But you've been trying to use it as an internal tool when it should be your primary revenue generator. This technology could be licensed to dozens of companies, creating multiple income streams that would more than cover your current debts. Board member James Patterson, a venture capitalist known for his tough questions, raised his hand. That's an interesting theory, Mr. Rodriguez, but licensing technology is notoriously difficult. How do you propose to make this work practically? David was ready for this question. He had spent hours researching comparable licensing deals and market opportunities. 3 major tech companies have already expressed interest in TechFlow's AI platform, according to your own internal reports. They were told it wasn't available for licensing. We changed that policy immediately. He clicked to the next slide, showing detailed financial projections. Conservative estimates suggest licensing revenue of $200 million in the first year, scaling to over $500 million by year 3. That's enough to service your current debt and fund continued innovation. The room fell silent as the board members studied the numbers. David could see some of them running calculations in their heads, checking his math against their own understanding of the market. Victoria's CFO, Michael Foster, spoke up from the far end of the table. These projections look optimistic. What's your confidence level on achieving these numbers? High, David replied without hesitation. But only if the implementation is done correctly. This isn't just about licensing technology. It's about creating a sustainable business model that maximizes value while maintaining innovation capacity. For the next hour, the board grilled David with questions that would have intimidated most seasoned consultants. They challenged his assumptions, questioned his data, and tested his understanding of complex financial instruments. David answered every question with the confidence that came from knowing he had done his homework thoroughly. Robert Chen leaned back in his chair, studying David with newfound respect. Mr. Rodriguez, I have to admit, your analysis is more comprehensive than anything we've seen from our traditional advisors. But implementation is always more complicated than theory. How do we know this plan will actually work? David had expected this question too. Because I'm not just proposing a plan, Mr. Chen. I'm offering to oversee its implementation personally. I'll stake my reputation on these results. The board members exchanged glances. This was unexpected. Most consultants delivered their recommendations and walked away, leaving others to deal with the messy realities of execution. Catherine Williams spoke first. That's a significant commitment, Mr. Rodriguez. What would you want in return? David took a deep breath. This was the moment he had been building toward since walking into Victoria's office that morning. I want a position as Vice President of Strategic Development, with authority to implement this restructuring plan. I want a salary commensurate with the value I'm bringing to the company, and I want the respect that comes with being judged on my abilities rather than my circumstances. The room was quiet for a long moment. Finally, Robert Chen spoke. I move that we vote on Mr. Rodriguez's proposal immediately. All in favor of implementing his restructuring plan? 12 hands went up around the table. The vote was unanimous. All in favor of offering Mr. Rodriguez the position of Vice President of Strategic Development? Chen continued. Again, 12 hands. David felt a surge of emotion that he struggled to contain. 3 years of invisible work, 3 years of swallowing pride and accepting dismissal, had led to this moment of recognition. Victoria stood up, extending her hand to David. Congratulations. Mr. Rodriguez, welcome to Sterling Enterprises. I think this is the beginning of a very interesting partnership. 6 months later, David stood in the same boardroom, presenting quarterly results that exceeded even his optimistic projections. The licensing program had generated over $300 million in revenue. Sterling Enterprises' stock had tripled in value. The company was not only saved, but thriving in ways that surprised industry analysts. More importantly, David had implemented programs to identify and develop talent regardless of background or current position. The company now actively recruited from unconventional sources, recognizing that brilliant minds could be found anywhere. After the board meeting, Victoria approached David in the hallway. She looked different than she had 6 months ago, still successful and confident, but with a warmth in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I owe you more than just a professional thank you," she said quietly. "You didn't just save my company. You taught me something important about how I see people and how I treat them." David smiled. "We both learned something, Victoria. I learned that sometimes you have to take risks to show people who you really are. And you learned that worth isn't measured by what someone wears to work." "About that promise I made at the country club," Victoria said, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "I know you said you didn't come to collect on a bet, but I've been thinking—" "Yes?" David prompted gently. "Would you like to have dinner with me? Not as CEO and VP, but as Victoria and David. I'd like to get to know the man who saw possibilities where everyone else saw problems." David's smile broadened. "I'd like that very much, but I choose the restaurant this time. Somewhere that judges the food, not the clientele." Victoria laughed, and the sound was genuine and warm. "Deal, as long as you promise to keep challenging me when I need it." "Always," David replied. "That's what partners do." As they walked toward the elevator together, David reflected on the journey that had brought him here. Sometimes the most important moments in life come disguised as humiliations. Sometimes proving your worth requires more than just credentials. It requires courage, determination, and the willingness to bet everything on your own abilities. The doorman who had been invisible was now impossible to ignore, and the woman who had judged him by his uniform had learned to see the person inside it. It was, David thought, exactly the kind of performance that mattered most.